Good afternoon, everyone. I would, of course, like to start by thanking Akshara, Ninasam, and all this beautiful team for inviting me here. I was here last in 2008. We had also performed a play here. And I have such beautiful memories of the people, the place, and everything that I have always wanted to come here again, and the team has given me the opportunity to do so again. I'm smiling because of two reasons. One is because my wife, who I'm married to for the last 40 years and who is more educated than me, in the morning told me that, why do you look so serious when talking? Why don't you smile when your theatre and novels are so humorous? I'm listening to her, she's more educated. And secondly, I have less time and too much to talk. That is not going to be humorous, I mind you. It is going to be rather serious. And so I'm going to run through, I'm going to read. It's very bad to read, I know that, but I'm a writer, I have to read, and the topic is vast. And as usual, I have too much to say in a short time. So I will try to make it as dramatic as possible for a writer, but then the limitations of a writer are obviously there. I'm going to speak slightly. Can I take it there? Okay. I'm going to speak about last 3 decades of Marathi theatre. So theatre from about 1985 or 1990. Many in the audience will not be exposed to Marathi theatre from this period, because I find world is still living, especially in the US and the UK, they are still living with P.L. Deshpande. They don't know that anything has happened after 1990. I don't know what is here, but at least abroad it is so. And it is difficult nowadays to get very good translators that we had yesterday. So I'm not going to speak directly about these number of plays, these writers, these directors, etc., etc. I'm going to start talking about what changes in conditions that have happened in this period, post 1985 or 1990, and how theatre is trying to deal with it, how theatre is trying to analyze it, interpret it, make meaning of it, etc., etc. Then at the end, I will mention a few writers, few plays, the changed practices of theatre, etc. I'm not going to talk about commercial theatre. I'm going to talk about experimental theatre. But I do not really make very watertight compartments. I'm very much against that, between experimental and commercial. As my predecessor just said, there are many. I refuse to define experimental theatre as something where audiences are not there, and the other way around. I mean, we do get audiences for experimental theatre, and we do have experimentation in commercial theatre. But very broadly speaking, I will be speaking on experimental theatre. So this period that I'm going to talk about, from 1985 to now, it has very uncanny resemblances, this period, to the conditions between 1920 and 1960. That is about, say, 80 years back or 60 years back. There are 3 great resemblances. One is that both came after so-called golden periods in theatre. Pre-1920, there was Khadilkar, there was Gadkari, there was Deval, there were many people. And pre-1985, there was Tendulkar, there was Alekar, there was Elkunchwar, etc. So it was also considered to be a golden period. Both these periods, the second instances, both these periods faced practical and commercial challenges in huge proportions. In 1931, the first talkie Alamara came. And so theatres were broken down, converted into cinemas, etc., etc. And post 1985, we obviously know the color TV, hundreds of private channels, OTT, internet, YouTube, easy access to internet and social media, so films, etc., etc. But more importantly, more than these two are always given as important reasons. But the third, in my opinion, is more important, at least for the experimental theatre. And that is, there was paradigm shift in the socio-political and existential conditions between this period, between 1920 and 1960 and post-1990. For example, post-1920 or around 1920, there were two world wars, Marxist revolution. Gandhi and Ambedkar both came to India, new era in politics began. The rise of American Cold War was there, colonial area ended nearly all over the world. Formation of two opposing radical organizations in 1925, the Communist Party of India and RSS at the same time. Country getting freedom accompanied by horrible bloodshed in partition and many other things. I will come to post-1985 conditions, but believe me, they were equally paradigmatic. Theatre or any art faces difficulty in keeping pace with such a radical and drastic change in the socio-political conditions, especially theatre, because theatre I find is because it's a group activity, it is not easy, and then you have to present it at the same time in front of audience, which for experimental may be 50 people, for commercial maybe 500, but you have to present in front of an audience here and now. So now allow me to start with a few words about the golden period, or the so-called golden period between 1965 and 1985, whose baggage the theatre today has had to carry. Any art is bound to socio-political conditions of a period in which, as I said, it is produced as a truism. The period around 1965 was a period when a new nation was coming of age. There were many hopes and equal number of disenchantments and disappointments about what had happened in first 2 decades after independence. There are many plays on workers' as theatre, etc., which were extremely alive then, though commercial theatre was not so active then. This is precisely why it is a period full of new movements, from Marxist to Dalit to feminist, and a new energy associated with them. Simultaneously, there was a plethora of new thoughts, isms, and movements that had developed in Europe in the recent past, and which were available as prototype to follow. For example, the Dalit Panther movement was inspired by Black Panther movement. I will come back to this point later. Society was far more homogeneous than it is today, or at least we like to believe it was. Many young people in high spirits with the shabnam bags and jholas on their shoulders were hoping for revolutions of all kinds. This was a wonderful breeding ground for a new kind of art, literature, painting, cinema, architecture, everything. And we see that happening everywhere. And theatre was no exception. It is interesting to note that 2 most important Marathi experimental plays, which changed the course of Marathi theatre, Gashiram Kotwal and Mahanirvan, came in 1972 and 1974 respectively. The 2 most important Hindi commercial films, Diwar and Sholay, which did the same for the commercial films, came in 1975. 2 such films in parallel cinema in Hindi, Ankur and Nishan, came in 74 and 75 respectively. And the first poetry collection, Golpitha, by arguably the greatest Marathi Dalit poet, Namdev Dhasar, came in 1973. So you see, nearly in those 4 years, everything from commercial, cinema, architecture, everything. Korea was building that time, Mr. Doshi was building that time, Chandigarh was being erected, everything. So it's not a coincidence that this happens. There was obviously a reason behind it. There was something very different happening. All these things were not only different, they were new, into inverted commas new. This was not only a coincidence. Energetic and interesting theatre was produced then. This came after a dark period for theatre, and so was even more effective or even more attractive. All this was new to us. We cannot expect such newness, into inverted commas, for a long time to come. At least not till artificial intelligence takes over, and I, for one, am not looking forward to that day. There are a few issues that we need to remember, though, which point to the limitations of the goldenness of this period also. And for one, this theatre was mainly a middle-class, upper-caste affair. Theatre has always been a middle-class activity, with exceptions like Dalits or workers' as theatre movements. including the theatre that I'm talking about in present times. The only difference is that middle classes of today are more socially inclusive and diverse than they were in the 1970s. So in the 70s, these middle classes who had interest in theatre were limited to a close circle of people. These were not plays which reached millions at all. Did they reach even the middle classes in substantial terms and bring about some serious social upheaval like Ibsen's play did, even in that limited space? The answer is in the negative. Apart from the exceptional plays like Gashiram Kotwal, most of the experimental plays did not go beyond a few dozen shows, even in that golden era. Secondly, these plays were called contemporary classics, and even now that nostalgia lingers and in fact is made to linger by a particular class of audience. But not only were many of these plays severely criticized even by their contemporaries, even Tendulkar was seriously criticized. Many of his plays were not called plays. People said that this is not theatre at all, and I've seen Tendulkar's handwritten apologetic, not apologetic in the excuse sense, but a defensive kind of writing and answers that no, this is theatre, what I'm doing is theatre. So it was not, so how can you call it contemporary classic if you are already challenged or already being questioned? And so, though I reiterate that some of the plays produced in this era were really good, even great plays, the iconization and its nostalgia have been a huge hurdle for the theatre which flourished after 1985. It is said that today, after 1985-1990, the golden period of Marathi theatre got over. The next generation is failing to reach the bars set by the golden period. Even if we accept this as true for a moment, a point arises which illustrates how writers are bound to social conditions of their period. Writers like Elkunchwar, Alekar, G.P. Deshpande, who belonged to that golden period, in fact they were the pioneers of that golden period, kept writing well after 1990. In fact, they were in their early or late 40s, so in their very productive prime at that time. For that matter, even Tendulkar, who was much older, was actively writing till nearly 2008. Why did these writers produce plays in the latter period which were no match to their older plays? And for that matter, they themselves will accept, and a few of them express that to me personally, that many new writers wrote and are writing plays better than they did after 1990. And so it brings me to the conditions that emerged after 1985 or 1990, which I claim was a paradigmatic shift from the past. I list only a few most glaring examples here. There are many changes, but these are the basic ones. Starting from the collapse of Soviet Union, which in a sense sidelined the left altogether and supported the idea that end of ideologies and even end of history was here to stay. Globalization and opening up came at the same time, and what is even more significant, this I think is most significant and we tend to forget it when we talk about globalization, is that it was essentially paired with capitalism, and that too neo-capitalism. Just try to imagine globalization in a socialistic framework, and the importance of this pairing will be evident. And when we talk, another important point about globalization is that when we talk of globalization, we mainly talk of labor and capital. Globalization of labor, globalization of capital, and we do not talk about cultural globalization, which has created more fragmentation. An equally or even more important thing was the change in technology, and at an extremely and unprecedented pace. From computers to PCs to mobiles to internet to artificial intelligence. And this was at a time when not all in India had an electrical connection. The fragmentation in the society, there was a fragmentation in the society, India no more lived at the same time. At a seminar on contemporary art, there is something like contemporary art in visual arts. This is the point I raised, that do we live in contemporary times at all? Does all India live in contemporary times? Then what is the contemporary time? Even if we concentrate on the section of society to which these changes has reached, the changes this new technology brought about, not only in communication, but in the process of thinking itself, were immense and the pace of change in the field of socio-psychology and interpersonal relations lagged behind pace of change in technology by decades. This change in technology was supposed to make the world flat, creating more equality and easy communication. What in fact has happened is the exact opposite. And the technology has become so unavoidable now that a poor person may not be able to have enough food, 2 meals a day, but needs a mobile phone to survive, even to get the monetary help that the populist governments offer them. This brought about 3 most important changes in the social reality. 1, the fragmentation of an individual and the society as well. 2, the extreme complexity, which is multipolar, and the operative word here is multipolar. And 3, the rise of the right-wing intolerance and majoritarianism in all over the world, including India, which in its turn gave more impetus to fundamentalism and terrorism on the other side. The social reality itself has become so bizarre. The reality itself has become so bizarre. Somebody was talking about reality and realism. The social reality itself has become so bizarre, spectacular, and violent that art has lost its bearing. Let me give an example of this. It is obvious that one play or one novel can never bring about a massive social change like a revolution. Any committed play also. But let me highlight. But it is obvious, but every artist, even then, expects to make some effect, into inverted commas, some meaningful intervention by her work. A musical performance of the great German musical composer and conductor Stockhausen of Hamburg Philharmonic Orchestra was organized towards the end of 2001. His performances are arranged on massive scale and months before the event. Just before the event, the world saw the terrorist attacks on Twin Towers, 9/11. Stockhausen came on stage, sat with his back toward the audience as the conductors do, left his baton, waited for a couple of seconds, kept the baton down, and left the performance. And that had cost millions of dollars, creating huge uproar. The justification he gave of his behavior later was, on the background of the violent spectacle that the world saw, there is no meaningful statement or effect possible through art anymore at all. But let me come back to the issue of complexity of present conditions. This is not to say that life before 1985 was not complex, but that society was more coherent and issues were more unilinear. A few years back, Tendulkar once asked me, why do you young writers create so much noise about the complexity? Do you mean to say that we did not deal with complexities at all? I gave him the same answer. Sir, life has always been complex, but now it has become multilinear. That is the big difference. I remember he had nodded then. Human beings have become empty and lonely. And what is worse, humans don't even seem to regret it anymore. On the contrary, this is being celebrated. In the era of virtual reality, reality seems to have become reality itself seems to have become a myth. Let's have a peek at 3 lives of 3 important writers from different eras, which will serve as example of this. The first example is from the life of a major Oriya writer from colonial times, Fakir Mohan Senapati. He was born in 1843, long time back, and was named Braja Mohan Senapati, clearly a very Hindu name. He was a Hindu person. In his childhood, Braja Mohan used to be chronically ill in spite of all kinds of medical treatment. His devout grandmother tried all Hindu vows and rituals. After the Hindu gods failed her, she went to Muslim saints. She promised them that she would allow Braja Mohan to be converted to their faith if they cured him. As luck would have it, Braja Mohan's health did improve, but now the grandmother had second thoughts about the conversion. So both sides came to an understanding. The grandmother allowed his name to be changed to Fakir as a symbolic gesture. She also consented the young Fakir Mohan going around the village for 8 days during Muharram, dressed like a Fakir for alms, and also to hand over whatever was collected by him. Without doubt, there was some religious tension in the process, but there was enough common space where their minds could meet and negotiate. The I, into inverted commas, I, the identity of Braja Mohan, alias the Fakir Mohan, got constructed in such an atmosphere. It is interesting to contrast Tendulkar's example with this. His plays raised huge commotion, mainly on identity issues, during the decade of 1970s. The attacks on him were severe, very severe, but politics involved was still unilinear and bipolar, like that between two castes or between reformists and revivalists. After a point, the storms subsided. The plays Gashiram Kotwal and Sakaram Binder, which raised huge storms, became extremely popular and ran for thousands of shows. This unilinear strife constructed Tendulkar's identity. The third example is also of one of my favorite writers. He belongs to the generation or two after Tendulkar, and his name is Orhan Pamuk, the famous Turkish writer. Turkey is a complex country to start with. It has a long history, a country which is Islamic, but which tried to adopt to European secular concept of modernity and secularism. A country where democracy survives on the insistence and under the auspices of the army. Pamuk is aware of the importance of traditions and strongly condemns the spiritual hollowness of the materialist, capitalist European society. As a secular modernist, he is opposed to Islamic fundamentalism, and at the same time, as a nationalist, also takes a stand against the hegemony of erstwhile communist Soviet Union. At the same time, he also points out the injustices done by Turkish government, his own national government, to the Kurdish people in the past. So as a consequence, he invites the wrath of modern European capitalist democratic societies, the so-called democratic government and army of Turkey, the Islamic fundamentalists, the Russian government, and the left progressive elements everywhere, all throughout the world, all at the same time. To top it all, he is awarded then a Nobel Prize, and the Turkish government has levied serious charges against him, and after the award, he becomes an international celebrity. The condition of these cases are far more multilinear. Pamuk's eye got constructed in this reality. We just have to look at the political affiliations, I hope you know, that have happened in my state, Maharashtra. The three parties against three parties that have come together, they are virtually same. You can't recognize them as separate. You can see to Syria and Ukraine, and I mean, it is impossible to decide who is on the correct side in these two wars to understand the multilinear complexity of today. What this absurd situation creates is anxiety in the mind of the common person. The absurdity gives birth to confusion and a feeling of cynicism. Then the powers that be can take advantage of this confusion, and especially now, with the captivating influence of faceless social media, fudge the issues even more to suit their ends. The era of what is called post-truth descends upon us. This is the gray area of today. This is the zeitgeist, as they say, spirit of the times today. How does the experimental theater, which is supposed to have fresh vision of truth, supposed to function in an era of post-truth? It is bound to face many problems than what it did in the past. This also produces a kind of ironical situation as far as taking position is concerned. Famous Kannada writer, you all must be very much aware of that, Mr. Anantamurthy has given an example of this in one of his articles, and I paraphrase in short. And he says, I have realized that nowadays I take the side of modernity when talking with a staunch traditionalist, and I try to stress the importance of tradition when faced with a radical modernist. So this is the problem that everyone faces now. Even though the exploitative practices of yesteryears were no less horrible, it was easy to decide who the exploiter and so who the enemy was. Now in this gray area, it is not to do so. In one of my plays, Chowk, Crossroads, it deals with such a situation. I will give an example. In the play, one of the characters is on the way to his work on a new job. The bus does not come on time as the drivers refuse to take out buses as there is a strike done by farmers on the road. So he has to go to work on his two-wheeler, which makes him even more angry as the petrol prices had gone up due to the war launched by President Bush on Iraq. Then he rises in an angry state of mind and there are many potholes on the road. He falls down. He skids and hurts himself. He is not able to go to the work for few days and he loses his contractual job. Now who is responsible? Who is the enemy? The bus driver? The farmers? President Bush? Iraq? Indian government for not keeping oil prices in control? The corrupt elected member of the local body? The corrupt contractor who built the road? Capitalism, which has introduced the policy of hire and fire? Bureaucracy? Democracy, which has come down to the level of populism and majoritarianism? And who or which policy do I support and how to fight this? What builds inside a human being in this condition is imported anger, which can then be diverted by the powers that be. The result of all this complexity and fragmentation is that when the world is coming together and becoming flatter, ironically we see smaller groups writing particular playwright or play rather than one play getting wider support. I come back to theatre now. Sorry for all that digression, but it has to be said. So now it is not surprising then that Marathi theatre is not producing the kind of theatre, the Gashiram Kotwals or the Sakaram Binders, like that in the 70s, when one play would appeal a large number of people at the same time. The situation is more complex in theatre than in literature, as theatre is a group activity again, which then is shared by the audience at large numbers at the same time. Secondly, till 1990, Marathi theatre and literature always had European prototypes to follow. Abhiram mentioned about, taking from the foreigners directly. I'm not referring to that, but at least prototypes. And for example, Tendulkar's plays were preceded by plays like Cat on Hot Tin Roof and Streetcar Named Desire. Absurd theatre came much before Alekar started writing, and modernist plays like those of Ibsen had come much before Il Kunchwar. Now the conditions are different. Playwrights are facing the same socio-political situation and existential questions all over the world. The conditions are in continuous flux and so fast a flux that prototypes become dated very fast. The result of all this, in my opinion, is that the definition of theatricality into inverted commas needs to change if we are to meet these new conditions. Traditionally, theatre was supposed to be sharply focused with linear progression, with rising tension arising out of unilinear conflicts. Living conditions have dramatically changed, but our ideas about drama have not. Unless we change our ideas about what is dramatic into inverted commas, theatre will not be able to deal with today's reality. If not, theatre will be unfit to live and will die a natural death. We will have to accept theatre, which is not unilinear. There are, of course, many possibilities, one of them being that theatre will work more like a collage. Playwrights have been trying to do this in Marathi, at least over the last 2 decades. Unfortunately, the audiences were not ready to accept this change to start with. Now we do see some change from that side as well. Now I will turn to some playwrights and plays, and finally. These are only indicative of what has been happening in theatre and not a complete overview of by any means, due to paucity of time, of course. I'll take Jan Pawar first because of his untimely and unfortunate death just a couple of years ago. Many of you may be aware that there was a huge strike of mill workers in Mumbai in 1980s, which ended in a disaster as the mills closed down and millions of workers lost their jobs. Jan's play Adhantar, Suspended, is about the next generation of these workers. The play has an old-style linear structure that has not changed, but the trajectory of the lives of the characters in the play go in such a varied direction, or directions, that we are made aware of the complexity that I have been talking about. The play was a huge success. In one of his other plays, Tengshecha's Swapna Train in the dream of Mr. Tengshe, he leaves this unilinear realistic framework altogether, and he weaves a pattern of real and the surreal in such a way that the complex violent spectacle that the urban reality has become today and the incapability of the protagonist to deal with it are revealed strongly. A play called Shobha Yatra, a ceremonial procession by Shafat Khan, is about a procession on the occasion to celebrate the Independence Day, in which actors in the garb of different political leaders involved in freedom fight. The procession gets delayed, the actors get bored, start arguing, fighting with each other. They're real life characters, and the characters they are portraying get mixed up, muddied up, and on the background of the current political scenario. Rajiv Naik's play, Sathe Kai Karaycha, It Is Not About Me, What to Do of This Man Sathe, was another play from these times in which he deals with the changed texture and nature of the severe but important and self-destroying jealousy in today's rat race and how it affects the relationship of a couple. Datta Patil, a young playwright who has written some extremely important plays about the changing rural world in today's times. And his plays, Dagad Ani Mati, Stone and Soil, deals with the idea of history. How a small village is left out because it does not have history, especially on the background of the idea of history that is being propagated by the powers that be now. To Rajahamsa Eka, the wonderful swan, he weaves a tragicomedy around the phenomena which is very common today. Young educated girls are not ready to marry boys from village who are doing farming. Mr. Patil uses free from and devastating humor to explore his themes. He succeeds in conveying the trauma of this seemingly unavoidable complex tension from the complex transition from the simple rural to the faceless and the complex urban. Two plays, Datta Bhagat's Vata Palavata and Ramnath Chauhan's Bamanwada, the mansion of the Brahmin, depict extremely complex stage at which the Dalit politics and social reality has come to today. They talk about how the Dalit movement itself has got fragmented and how the powers that be are taking advantage and leaving the youth frustrated and how the youth are driven to violent means. These two plays from the late 80s and early 90s, in my opinion, are the most mature plays belonging to the Dalit theatre movement which blossomed in late 70s. I must mention one extraordinary play, Shivaji Underground in Bhimnagar Mohalla. Shivaji Underground in the ghetto of Bhimnagar by Rajkumar Tangade, which deals with a very sensitive issue about how particular communities have iconized the Shivaji to suit their purpose and how he was far more liberal and how it has affected today's political scenario. I think the play has survived the wrath of the right-wing groups only because it has been backed by strong Dalit organizations. Dharmakirti Sumant, one of Marathi's young playwrights, like Datta Patil, and who comes from urban background, in his play Gele 21 Varsha, last 21 years, depicts the depression of 21-year boy today who is frustrated at his parents and teachers at the time, talking about Phule, Ambedkar and Gandhi all the time, and on the contrasting conditions of the society today. Now I will turn to a few of my plays. I will take advantage of myself being a speaker and talk about, don't be afraid, not all, but 4 of my plays in brief. Te Pude Gele, they went ahead, we performed it here. Talks about the particular kinds of development which we call unavoidable now, into inverted commas, and the exploitation inherent in it. The mindset of no, not where, but going ahead, again is inverted commas, due to the current state of capitalism, but not through the depiction of the woes of the oppressed, which can be a typical tearjerker, but by depicting the callousness and desensitization of the new middle classes. We had performed this play here in Hindi. I've already referred to my play Chowk. I've been haunted by the changes in technology, the pace of change and its psychosocial impact on humans. In short, I've tried to deal with the philosophy of technology. I'm not a philosopher. I apologize to those who are here, but in my own way, I've tried to do that, which in my opinion is the most important subject in this period after 1990s. And even more so in future it will be, now that we are going to deal with artificial intelligence. My first play, 4 Billion Forgetfuls, in which I have depicted a capitalistic society where life itself has become the medium of exchange or a currency. If I work for 1 month, I earn his salary in my lifetime, say 2 months. Capital becomes a metaphor in the play. And in my last play, Prasthan Urfa Exit, Yamaduta's app malfunctions and the person who is supposed to die does not die. And what is depicted through this weird situation is that loneliness, strained relationship, and the feeling of absurdity that the current tech scenario is bringing on. Technology and its impact on human society and human psychology have been one of the themes that have been driven many of my novels as well. But all these writers that I have mentioned have to face an additional problem which I cannot avoid talking about. The most important aspect which affects theatre today is fear with capital F. Maharashtra is one of those few states where the Censorship Act of 1876 from colonial era is still operative. I do not understand how free democratic country where anyone above the age of 18 is allowed to vote and choose who would rule them cannot be allowed to choose what to see. And in the colonial era, as well as in the first few years after independence, there was at least no extra-constitutional censorship by senas and dals and groups and organizations of all sorts. When P.L. Deshpande wrote a play, Podhari Paije, we need a leader. Remember the name. We need a leader. In 1950s, the leftist playwright Annabhau Sathe did not agree with his idea. But he did not go and beat up P.L. Deshpande or vandalize his performance. He wrote a play titled Pudhari Milala, We Have Got a Leader, challenging P.L.'s play. Much earlier, much earlier, in 1899, Will Deval wrote a pro-women play, Sharda, that my previous speaker mentioned. Even the then traditionalist and so-called fundamentalist people did not blacken his face. They wrote plays propagating their own ideas. For last 60 years, and so, these extra-constitutional censorship has been growing and over last dozen or so years has increased exponentially. This is true of all hues and sections of the society, but much more true in case of the right-wing groups as the powers that be are supporting them. This hurts theatre, even theatre of every kind, but it is even more harmful for experimental theatre because experimental theatre, by definition, is a theatre, whether successful or not, is a theatre which has a new vision, is full of new ideas which go against the old ones, the established ones, and the so establishment itself. It should go against the establishment itself because it has new thoughts. So nowadays, either the play gets caught in official censors to start with, if not the unofficial ones, and worse, to avoid this, theatre workers start imposing self-censorship, the worst kind of censorship. In an era when fragmentation is making practice of theatre difficult as it is, this fear of nearly destroying experimental theatre where new ideas can be freely expressed. Now I come near the end, just bear me for 2 more minutes. I have concentrated on the content till now in my lecture, whether in writing or performance. Now I will turn briefly and talk about a couple of issues related to the practice of theatre before I end. Before 1990s, the theatre in Marathi was extremely playwright-centric, as my previous speaker very rightly said, where the director tried to follow what the writer wanted to say to the T. This, in my opinion, has been harming Marathi theatre as it did not allow any other interpretation. Neither did it explore what could be conveyed through visual design and body acting fully. It is still a writer and word dominated to a large extent, but the new breed of directors have emerged who are boldly experimenting with the scripts and also doing devised theatre. This has brought in a fresh interpretation and amazing visual delineations. Unfortunately, as always, there is a flip side to it. At times, these design elements become so overpowering that basic content, the play of ideas, gets relegated to the back and the performance becomes a spectacle. And let me make a somewhat bold statement at the end of the talk. This fits in very well with the kind of festival culture that is becoming dominant in India today, which gives much more importance to the spectacle than the content. I'm not going to give a list of directors here, but I will mention only a few names, prominent amongst the directors who started around 1985 and have witnessed and participated in the change were Atul Pethe, Chandrakanta Kulkarni and Vijay Kienkre. The important young directors who were most instrumental in bringing this transition and working this new era are Mohit Takarkar, Alok Rajwade, and Sachin Shinde. Other fact being that the fast life and 70 hours a week working pattern in the current capitalist society, which measures the value of everything in money and nothing else, has made the number of audiences dwindle. This is how I see Marathi theatre today. It is evident that it is confused and struggling on some levels. However, that does not mean that it is totally bereft of important place. Youth is getting again attracted to theatre in Marathi. Audiences have started to appreciate the experiments that are required to meet the change the conditions to a certain extent. These plays are trying to deal with complex reality of the day, which is very difficult indeed, albeit the number of plays is still limited. But on the other hand, the number of excellent plays in any era has always been limited. How many really good plays were staged in one decade, even in that golden period of theatre of 70s? 8, 10? If you take Europe, how many good active playwrights or directors are there today in a country like UK, France or Germany? 8, 10? I doubt if the number is even that large. The forest looks more dense than it actually is when seen from a distance. This is the biggest problem regarding talking about the contemporary history. Thank you.